Okay, so I'm delighted to welcome now our afternoon keynote speaker, Bianca Fileborn from University of Melbourne, where she is a senior lecturer in criminology. And she just kind of seems to pop up in the UK every 2 to 3 years for a week. So we've been really, really lucky that the stars have aligned or whatever, if you believe that sort of stuff. But either way, we are really lucky to welcome her here today. She's the author of a number of books and papers on different aspects of men's violence against women, including Reclaiming the Nighttime Economy and more recently, Me Too and the Politics of Social Change. Welcome, Bianca.
All right, thanks so much, Nicole. I'm just going to set a timer for myself. So I'm here all the way from Melbourne, and you may or may not know we had one of the longest COVID lockdowns in the world. So this is the first time in a number of years that I've been in an actual room with people, which is both exciting and mildly terrifying. So I'm going to do my best. So I'm going to be talking to you today about some findings from a project that I've been working on over the past 3 years that was, I should acknowledge, funded by the Australian Research Council. So this project was, well, part of it included interviews with people who've experienced harassment in public spaces and on the street, looking at, their experiences and the impacts of that harassment across their life course. But more importantly, for today, looking at their perceptions of justice and the types of responses that they would actually like to see implemented. Also just want to acknowledge some of the people who have named on the slide. So although I was the sort of lead researcher on the project, there are a number of people who I've collaborated with, including Fiona on a book chapter that's coming out soon, I think. I don't know. Okay, so just for some background to the project. So we've heard quite a bit already around what street harassment is. Within the context of this project, I was really drawing on Callie's continuum model. So I was interested in hearing about the full continuum or spectrum of behaviours that participants might have experienced, and we'll see some examples of those in a second. I was also using an intersectional approach, so certainly I was looking at gender-based and sexual or sexist harassment experienced by cisgender women, but I was also interested in forms of harassment based on things like race, homophobic and transphobic harassment, and so forth. So I guess I also wanted to reiterate this idea, and I think we saw this in Fiona's presentation earlier, that a lot of harassment can be, quite ambiguous, context dependent, and behaviours that are quite easily excused or normalised. And as we'll see, I think this has really important implications for how we can kind of best respond to street harassment. Again, as we already know, street harassment is incredibly common, especially for young women. Research has very clearly established that street harassment has ongoing cumulative harms across our life course, but it's also something that's often trivialized and normalized as an occurrence. So, it's dismissed as a joke, a compliment, friendly banter, and so forth. And I think this normalization and trivialization of harassment are also reflected through the fact, I'm going to make a sweeping generalization here, that street harassment is quite poorly responded to through current policy and practice, particularly in Australia. However, I do think this is slowly changing, particularly in the international and European contexts. So part of the impetus for the research that I've done over the past 3 years actually was that several jurisdictions internationally have begun to introduce legislative and other policy changes introducing street harassment. So we've seen France, for example, introduce on-the-spot fines for catcalling. I'm sure most of you are aware that there's currently a campaign in the UK to criminalise street harassment being led by Our Streets Now. And in 2018, Washington, DC took a different approach and introduced civil legislation addressing street-based harassment. So that didn't criminalise harassment, but it did introduce a definition of what street harassment is, and it created an impetus for government to introduce policy, training, and some data collection. So, on I guess, a hopeful note that there is actually some movement around the issue, and we are actually starting to see it taken seriously, at least in some respects. However, that said, we actually know very little at this point about, well, what do the people who've actually experienced street harassment want done in response to it? Do they actually want things like on-the-spot fines? And I think that this is a really important question to ask, particularly given that there is a criminal legal emphasis in a lot of these responses that have either been introduced or are being advocated for. So we know from research with victims, survivors of other forms of sexual and gender-based violence that the criminal legal system is often a site of harm and injustice. We also know that survivors have quite a broad range of justice needs or interests. So that is, what are the things that they need to happen to feel like a sense of justice has been achieved? Certainly some of those needs can be met within the criminal legal system. However, a lot of them are simply unable to be. We also know from work like Nicole Westmarland and Claire McGlynn that survivors have quite diverse justice interests that can actually shift and change over time. So there's not necessarily one single justice response or mechanism that is ever going to meet all survivors' needs at any given time. I think, so obviously this work on sexual and gender-based violence is insightful, and a lot of street harassment is a form of sexual and gender-based violence. That said, I think there are also some unique aspects to street-based harassment that can make it potentially challenging to respond to, particularly through a criminal legal system. So, for example, the fact that these incidents can be quite fleeting or ambiguous or contested in nature, or as Fiona mentioned earlier, actions like staring or telling someone to smile that are almost impossible to regulate through a criminal legal response. So we also don't know, to what extent do the justice needs or interests of people who've experienced street harassment actually align with those of victim survivors of other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Getting ahead of myself. So this was essentially the starting point for this project. I wanted to know, what are street harassment victims' justice needs, and how can we actually achieve a sense of justice in response to street harassment? So these are the research questions. I think they're, oh no, that's still project background, there we go. Research questions, sorry, haven't done this for a while, struggling with changing the PowerPoint slides. So these are the questions which I've basically already spoken through, but I wanted to talk to people about the nature of their experiences, the impacts that they've had, but like I said, how are people who've experienced street harassment actually understanding justice, and what are the types of justice responses that they would like implemented. And I also spoke with key stakeholders, but I won't be drawing on that data today. So again, really brief overview. So there were 4 phases to this project. So the first was a kind of mapping of policy and activism across Australia, UK and the US. The second phase that I'll be speaking to today was interviews and a Google mapping exercise with people who'd had self-defined lived experiences of street harassment in Victoria and New South Wales in Australia. Although people spoke about things that happened all over the world. The final, or third phase, was talking to key stakeholders. And then the final phase was led by one of my master's students last year, who was looking at community perceptions of street harassment. Okay, so on the next couple of slides, just a content note that there will be some quite explicit descriptions of people's experiences. So I'm just going to skim over this really quickly because, again, I think it really just reiterates what we've already heard, particularly from Fiona's presentation this morning. So participants in this project really discussed experiences that spanned that full continuum of sexual and gender-based violence. And I've got some kind of illustrative quotes of common experiences on the slides. So certainly the most common things that participants were discussed were, forms of harassment that I think are stereotypically minor and, the most likely to be kind of normalized and excused. So things like catcalling, verbal comments, staring and leering, wolf whistling, lots of car horn honking and car-related harassment. That said, participants did also discuss incidents that would likely meet legal thresholds for sexual harm. So things like indecent exposure, public masturbation, sexual and physical assaults and rape. So participants also discussed experiences of intrusion, to draw on Fiona's term. So these were, incidents that were perhaps not overtly offensive or kind of explicitly wrong, but that were still lived as a form of gendered harm. So, for example, participants would often discuss incidents of men approaching them for kind of a friendly conversation or imposing on them when they were sitting down to eat their lunch on their lunch break. And even though, again, there wasn't anything kind of overtly offensive about what was happening, there was this real sense that, I don't think this would be happening to me if I was a man. Like, it was still lived and interpreted as a kind of, gendered intrusion, or participants had this kind of intuition or gut feeling that the person who was approaching them didn't actually have good intentions. So I think it's important to note the huge scope, I guess, of behaviours that were discussed and raised. But again, also just to reiterate that some of these experiences were ambiguous and were forms of interaction that could be completely welcome in other contexts. And I think that this is something that really adds to the challenges of responding to street-based harassment. So as I mentioned, the project adopted an intersectional lens, and participants spoke about a range of experiences that were also underpinned by things like racism, homophobia, and transphobia, in addition to gender-based and sexualized harm. And of course, these forms of harassment often overlapped in really significant ways, as some of the participant quotes illustrate. So, people would often experience things that were simultaneously sexist and homophobic, and you couldn't really disentangle what the root cause or motivation, I guess, for that harassment was. So I think it's important to stress that we don't, just view street harassment as a women's issue or as being solely about gender. It's something that we have to approach from an intersectional lens. I also wanted to just briefly flag that, of course, participants experienced harassment across a wide range of settings, but there were some really notable hotspots that came up repeatedly in people's experiences. So schools were really significant, particularly for cisgender women. It was often when they first started experiencing harassment, and it was typically while they were in their school uniform. Participants felt that they were quite purposely targeted as identifiable school children. And they often commented that they were, too young to fully understand what was happening at the time. And it was often years later, often once they'd had, some engagement with, feminism, that they were able to look back and kind of reinterpret those experiences. Licensed venues and entertainment spaces came up a lot, as did public transport, and of course on the kind of general street and sidewalk. And I'm mentioning this because I think it's important in that it perhaps suggests that there are some areas that we could be looking at doing some really targeted intervention. Okay, so reporting, again, I think reporting to authority figures, particularly police and security, is important to look at because, again, a lot of the responses that have been advocated for involve a police response. And overwhelmingly, people in this project did not report to police. And that those who did, they were a minority, but for those who did report to police, they overwhelmingly had negative experiences. Some people were quite overtly dismissed or victim blamed from police. But even if people felt that they were believed and taken seriously, there was no outcome, I guess, to their report. So there were a range of reasons why people didn't report to police or other authority figures. So firstly, the idea that it was too trivial, either that the person who'd experienced harassment felt that themselves, or they thought that the person that they were reporting to wouldn't take it seriously, again, that they'd be dismissed, it was just a compliment, what's the big deal? Secondly was this idea that the perceived costs of actually reporting, particularly to police, were seen to outweigh the actual harms of the individual incident itself. So, a lot of people said, well, some guy drove past and yelled something incomprehensible out the car window. It was over in 30 seconds. I don't want to spend the next, half of the day going to police, reporting, all of the kind of time and emotional labor that would cost. It kind of, just wasn't seen as being worth it, particularly because they also thought that they wouldn't be taken seriously and that it wouldn't actually achieve anything. And a lot of people spoke about just wanting to, get on with their day, to move on with things. Quite a number of people raised the poor or perceived poor criminal legal response to other forms of gendered, or particularly gendered and sexual violence, but also transphobic and homophobic violence. So participants were very aware, and I think this is quite well supported by the research on survivors' experiences with the criminal legal system. They were very aware that there were low rates of reporting, that survivors who did go through the system were often, re-traumatized, not believed, didn't necessarily have a successful court outcome, and so forth. So I think there was a perception of, well, if police aren't responding well to forms of gendered violence that are, quote unquote, more serious, why, they're not going to care if I tell them about, someone who yelled at the car window at me. Similar kind of comments were raised around transphobic and homophobic responses from police, and a small number of people were actually perpetrated against by police, which is my next point. There we go. And then finally was the issue that there was no kind of tangible evidence that you could actually take to police or to an authority figure to prove what had happened. And obviously this varies hugely depending on the type of harassment that we're talking about. But particularly for those more, I guess, commonly experienced forms of harassment where someone looked at you, maybe someone made a comment, or woof whistled out the car and they were gone 20 seconds later, people would raise, make comments like, well, what am I going to go to what am I going to say to the police? There was a man in a red car with brown hair who screamed something at me. I don't have his number plate. There's nothing that you could actually take to the police that they could action. So it was seen to be a kind of a fruitless effort. And finally, people were also unsure if what had happened was actually reportable. Again, this was mostly the case for things like staring, verbal comments, etc. Participants didn't know, was that actually against the law? Is this something that police can actually do anything about? Although there were similar comments made for things like flashing and public masturbation as well, which are most definitely criminal offences in the context of the project. Okay, so what did participants actually define as justice? How do they understand this concept? So I'm just going to talk through this particular slide very quickly because, as it turns out, asking people how do you define justice was a very difficult question to answer, and people really struggled with it. So when I said to people, how do you define justice, I often got quite I guess, surface level responses, right? So people would make reference to things like fairness and equality, and I guess kind of stereotypical definitions of justice. But if you ask people to kind of, dig in a little bit deeper around, well, what does fairness mean in responding to street harassment? They really struggled to articulate that. And that's, just to be clear, not having a go at my participants. I think I would really struggle to answer this question as well. There were a couple of things that came up that I think were more significant and that really aligned with some of the other research on survivors' justice interests and justice needs. So particularly validation and recognition. So this idea that people wanted street harassment to be taken seriously as an issue came through really clearly. Perpetrator accountability, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And for some people that was, they were quite retributive, I guess, that they wanted their perpetrator to suffer. But for most people, they really wanted an approach that was around educating the perpetrator and changing their attitudes and behaviour. And finally, and I think quite importantly, a number of people said that there is no justice in response to my experiences. They've already happened. I have been irreparably changed because of those experiences, and there is nothing that can be done retroactively to achieve a sense of justice. So I also asked participants to reflect on whether they would be supportive of criminal legal responses to street harassment, whether that was, the introduction of on-the-spot fines or, criminal legislation that was specifically governing street harassment. So I think it's important to note and to recognise that for a small number of participants, they were supportive of these types of responses. However, they were in the minority. Most participants either absolutely did not support this type of response, or they supported it to some extent, but they were qualified and ambivalent in their support. And I think the quote on the slide really demonstrates this. So there was often a sense of, yeah, great, in an ideal world, I would love it if there was, legislation, on the spot fines, fantastic. But there were really serious questions raised around how this would actually operate in practice. And I'll talk through some of those concerns in a second. But in terms of support for a criminal legal response, participants did feel that it could help to hold harassers to account, particularly in a context where, at least in Australia, there was almost absolutely nothing else done in response to street-based harassment. This was seen as something that was expressing that, this is wrong and there are consequences for your behaviour. People thought it could provide a deterrent function, although importantly, they thought it would act as a deterrent in the sense that men didn't want to get fined, not a deterrent in the sense that it would actually change their attitudes or those underlying beliefs and values that enable street harassment. And finally, people thought it served a really important symbolic function. So it was, the state saying, we understand and perceive street harassment as wrong and as a form of harm. But like I said, most people really did not support the introduction of criminal legal responses, and there were a wide range of reasons for this. So firstly, as I've already touched on, it was seen as not being feasible to implement. So, again, a lot of this behaviour can be quite covert, quite fleeting, quite ambiguous. There's not necessarily that tangible evidence. So people had serious questions around what impact it would actually have in real life. As I've already flagged, a lot of people felt like it didn't actually, address the root causes of the issue. So introducing, a criminal legal response or on-the-spot fines doesn't necessarily teach men anything about why street harassment is wrong or harmful. And some people I spoke to, actually more so in my key stakeholder interviews, thought that on-the-spot fines could actually be counterproductive, particularly for men who perceive this behaviour as being totally normal. I was just giving her a compliment. What's the big deal? So this was a really major concern, particularly for on-the-spot fines. Participants felt that this type of legislation or response would be directly implicated in the over-policing of marginalised groups. So particularly in the Australian context, Indigenous men, men of colour, men with mental health concerns or homeless people. I should also say that these interviews were taking place at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, and a lot of participants quite explicitly referenced those protests during the interviews. So I think people were, hyper aware of the potential of criminal legal responses to directly contribute towards other forms of inequality and harm. Again, as I've already touched on, there was a real lack of trust in the police and the criminal legal system to actually respond appropriately and well to street harassment, as well as other forms of gendered and heteronormative violence. So what did participants actually want, if not a criminal legal response? Oh gosh, I'm almost out of time. Okay, I'll go through this very quickly. So when I actually asked people about the tangible responses that they wanted, it was very clear through their suggestions that participants wanted responses that involved the prevention of street harassment and the transformation of the conditions that actually enable or underpin street harassment. And this relates back to that concept of there being no justice in response to street harassment after the fact. But it also related to all of those concerns that I've raised around the fact that street harassment is often ambiguous, fleeting, it's culturally sanctioned and normalised. That for all those reasons it was seen as being very difficult to deal with after the fact. So participants wanted it not to happen in the first place. I think a second issue here, and the quote on the slide hopefully demonstrates this, that individual incidents of harassment on their own weren't always a problem. Of course, this varies wildly depending on the nature of the incident. But for a lot of participants, it wasn't the kind of one-off wolf whistle or cat call. It was the fact that they were experiencing these incidents, multiple times over years of their lives. So it was this cumulative impact of lots of smaller incidences. Oh, I did set this a little bit early, so I think I've still got 5 minutes because I always go over time. I'm sorry. Lots of small things are happening over time that the impacts of those kind of added up in a synergistic way that was bigger than the sum of its parts. And this type of harm is really difficult to respond to through our formal legal system, which is really set up to respond to the actions of individuals who have caused harm and on specific incidences of harm. So participants also saw justice in relation to street harassment as being deeply interconnected with other forms of structural oppression and disadvantage. So it really wasn't seen as a standalone issue, but something that requires a really multifaceted and complex response, as the second quote on the slide illustrates. So people referred to other forms of structural inequality and oppression, again, particularly relating to things like race and heteronormativity. But as this person's pointed to, it's was also seen as being interconnected with things like socioeconomic inequality, access to health, education, and so forth. Okay, this is the last slide. So what did people want? So there were four really clear themes in terms of the tangible, practical responses that participants wanted, although these, of course, overlapped and interconnected with each other. So education and training were by far the most common response that participants discussed. And there was a perceived need for education and training-based initiatives across a wide range of settings. So I think probably the most common was incorporating street harassment into respectful relationships and consent education in schools, but people also discussed public awareness raising campaigns, and we've already seen some fantastic examples of those in this morning's panel. People wanted targeted interventions for harassers, but also training for staff and authority figures in some of those hotspots, like licensed venues. And some people also wanted police to be trained as well, so that for those people who did want to report, they were more likely to at least have an appropriate and supportive response. Perpetrator accountability, which I flagged earlier. So participants really wanted perpetrators to be held to account. And as I flagged, that didn't necessarily mean a punitive response. So participants really wanted harassers to understand the nature of their actions and to understand why they were wrong, why they were harmful, and to actually engage in meaningful behavioural change. Bystander intervention, also incredibly common, and again, something we've seen discussed earlier today. So I think bystander intervention was seen as being a really immediate way of holding harassers to account, and as something that could strongly convey that their actions weren't condoned and weren't socially accepted by those around them. I think it's unclear whether bystander intervention can actually achieve that in practice. At this point, I don't think we actually have a strong evidence base, if any evidence, around the impact of bystander intervention on the person perpetrating harassment. However, bystander intervention did also express a really immediate support for the person who'd experienced harassment and was experienced as being very validating, I guess, of their experience. So I do think there's merit in promoting bystander intervention as something that supports the person who's experienced harassment, but we need more evidence in terms of whether it's effective in changing the behaviour of harassers. Oh, my last point, sorry, I know. And then finally, reporting mechanisms. So this was, I think, probably less commonly mentioned than the others, but I do think that it's an important one to flag, and I think something that is quite tangible and practical to introduce. And participants were really supported both formal and informal reporting mechanisms. Some people, quite explicitly said that they wanted a range of options in terms of how and where they could report. And again, this was seen as having a really important symbolic function. Having reporting mechanisms in place communicated that, street harassment is something that's actually serious enough to warrant reporting in the first place. So I think collectively, the findings from this project really suggested that justice is something, at least in response to street harassment, something that's best achieved outside of the criminal legal system, and really highlights the need for efforts that focus on prevention and transformation. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bianca, for a really thought-provoking talk. We are running a little bit behind, but that's not Bianca's fault. That's because we started slightly late after lunch, and we also have borrowed some time from the wrap-up to do the poster presentation results a little bit earlier. So we will still take a question or two for Bianca. You don't get away with it that lightly. So who would like to ask a question? Yeah, the front.
Thanks, Bianca. That was really interesting. Do you think that kind of zero tolerance of street harassment can potentially, or is there any evidence to say that intolerance of street harassment can then influence what is commonly regarded as more serious sexual crimes?
Yeah, so do you mean influence men's behaviour, or yeah? I haven't seen anything that's actually like evaluated, I guess, or investigated the impact on men. So I think for me, the kind of short response is, I don't know, we don't know. So my master's student who did a survey on, like, with the general community on community perceptions, her survey found that most people had a pretty good understanding of what harassment was, and, you know, they understood, like, labeled things as harassment, didn't victim blame, etc., which, you know, again, maybe suggests that most people actually do get that it's, you know, not okay. But in terms of, you know, the impact on men who engage in this behavior, I haven't seen anything done. You know, all of the work on bystander intervention is mostly psychological studies with people as, you know, potential bystanders and rating their perceived confidence and efficacy in intervening. We know all very, very little about, like, actual real life intervention, and how does that, you know, impact on either the perpetrator or the person who's experienced harm. So for me, it's probably one of the, like, most pressing areas of research that we need to be looking into is, you know, what's the impact of all of this? Because, you know, I think a lot of these things sound really promising in theory, but, you know, as we know, like, really well-intentioned campaigns and interventions can backfire or be counterproductive in ways that we just didn't predict. So yeah, sorry, it's probably not a very satisfying answer, other than that we need to do more. And I think as well, you know, it's really challenging to actually engage men who are doing this behavior in research. Like, funnily enough, a lot of people don't want to admit to engaging in harassment. So it's a real challenge. I don't know if Stephen has the answers, maybe, I don't know.
Gitanjali, and that'll probably be the last question.
Hi, thanks for that presentation. It's really interesting. I enjoyed it. I wanted to ask a question about accountability as one of your responses from the respondents in terms of what they wanted from perpetrators. And I was wondering, obviously, there seemed to be a sense that actually the criminal justice system was not seen as a good option. So what was the form that accountability and behavior change was going to be manifested? Did your respondents talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, and obviously, you know, it's very hard to think of, like, what it might look like in practice. Or if a lot of people just said, I want them held accountable, or I want them to be educated, but it was difficult to articulate what that might look like. But I think the most common things were bystander intervention, both from strangers, but also having their mates call them out. You know, a lot of people experienced harassment from groups of men, particularly groups of young men. So they wanted, you know, their mates to be saying, hey, that's not okay. Again, I don't think we know a lot about how effective that is in practice, but that was certainly really commonly raised. Basically, like, men's behaviour change programs, so, like, really targeted educational interventions with men who'd harassed. There are huge questions about how we would actually do that in practice. I know in the Australian context, the men's behavioural change programs are almost exclusively run with men who have been referred by the courts. So I don't know how we would practically do that for something like street harassment, you know, for things that are not against the criminal law, which might be actually an argument in favour of introducing criminal legislation. But, you know, how do we actually get men into those programs? Huge question. Schools were the other setting where I think people thought there was real potential for targeted, direct intervention, because you've kind of got a bit of a captive audience with young people, and you perhaps can, you know, mandate that they undertake some form of educational program. But yeah, it's a great question, and again, I think really challenging to achieve in practice. You know, one thing that got raised a lot from key stakeholders was that we just don't have the resources to do a lot of this work either, right? Like, the men's behaviour change sector don't have funding to deal with people who have actually gone through the legal system or have been referred by the police and courts, let alone, you know, to work with people who are engaging in street harassment. So yeah, challenging. We need more money as always, but yeah, thanks. Great question.
Right, thank you again, Bianca.